This issue is all about color work. Color work's so important in the winter because, well, it keeps you warm. It's also fun to knit. Let me show you how. There's two main kinds of color work. Stranded, also known as Fair Isle and Intarsia. They're completely different and they require completely opposite techniques, which can get you into trouble if you're just starting out. I want to clarify the two. Stranded colorwork, or Fair Isle, uses strands. That is, what you're doing is you're always using two colors in a row or a round, and the color that you're not knitting with at a given moment, so here if you see I've got orange and brown, if I'm knitting with the brown, the orange sits in the back and rests as a float. Those floats are fantastic because what they do is create a lining. The lining helps with warmth and it helps with making your knitting windproof, which is why we care about it so much for winter accessories, hats, mittens, gloves, that kind of thing. The other type is Intarsia, as you can see in this sweater here. The thing about Intarsia is it's blobs of color, and if you look at the back of my mousse, you see here that what I've got is a big blob of brown with white on either side. For that, we don't use two colors at a time. We only use one at a time, and we change color when we need to. Completely opposite techniques. I'm going to focus on stranded colorwork, or Fair Isle, because that's what's mostly in this issue.
When you're ready.
One of the patterns in this issue is the Fool for All Seasons hat, which I absolutely adore. And it's a classic stranded colorwork pattern because the motifs are quite small, and what you get is you get a lot of repetition, so it's easy to memorize, and they're little motifs with a lot of diagonals, and those help manage the tension. We sometimes refer to this technique as Fair Isle, and it's sort of a brand name thing. It's like Fair Isle is to stranded as Kleenex is to facial tissue. We associate these kinds of techniques with Fair Isle, the tiny Shetland island, but of course they're used in all sorts of knitting traditions. And I want to talk about how to do it. I've got a big example here, and I'm just going to work with these two colors on these giant needles. There are three ways of handling the yarns, and which you do is really up to you. You will get lots of opinion about which is the appropriate method, especially if you're just starting out. The appropriate method is the one that works best for you. You can work with both of the yarns in your right hand, you can work with one in each hand, or you could work them both in your left hand, and I'm going to demo all three of those. The key for stranded colorwork is not to tangle the yarns. You do not want to twist them around each other. It doesn't matter if they twist a tiny bit as you move around, but really what you want to avoid is them crossing when you change colors. That makes the experience more unpleasant. It also tightens up your work. When you're changing colors, really what you need to do, if you're working with both in right hand, is establish an upper color and a lower color. Here I'm just going to knit with one or the other. I'm not really following my pattern here. What I do, if I establish the orange as my upper color, I pull it over the blue, and if I establish the blue as my lower color, I bring it under the orange, and I will move slowly here. I'm just going to alternate colors. The trick is, you see the orange comes over and the blue comes under. The trick is that these two are not crossing over each other. And you should check this as you're working. Have a look at the two ends of yarn coming from the balls. If they're starting to twist, that means that you are twisting as you work. It's not a nightmare disaster if they twist around each other a couple of times, but you really don't want it twisting a lot because it's going to tighten up your work, and it's also frankly a lot less pleasant to do. So keep them in their positions relative to each other, and if I work a few stitches with my blue and then I change the orange again, I just see I'm pulling it over. And the blue, I'm going to do a couple more with the orange, just so you can see what it looks like, and the blue comes under. And the reason Fool for All Seasons is such a great starter project for stranded colorwork is there's not a lot of stitches with one color before you change to the other, and that helps you manage your tension as well. And a classic Fair Isle pattern might only have 5 or 6 stitches before you have to change to another, and that helps you keep things even. Working with both yarns in the same hand is not elegant. It does get the job done. The traditional, perhaps classical way of doing this is one yarn in each hand though, and it's certainly more efficient. So if you're good at working with both hands, English and continental, then this is a terrific way of doing things. And what you get here is you get a natural way of preventing the yarns crossing because they're not touching. And also you see when I change the orange, do you see how it's naturally pulling over? And the blue is coming from under. And so you get a lovely, efficient way of doing it. And this is tremendous for managing the yarns, and it can be helpful for managing the tension. If you're very skilled with your left hand, you can also work with both yarns in your left hand if you're naturally a continental knitter. This requires, again, vigilance about the upper and lower. And so when I go to get the orange, what I need to do is I need to come over the blue to grab that. And when I go to get the blue, make sure I don't get involved with the orange. And this is where one of those little stranding guides, you may have seen these things, little plastic or spring things that sit on your finger. Those could be used to separate the two yarns. This is my swatch for the Fool for All Seasons hat. I was playing with the colors. I've got a bit of an R2D2 thing going on here. I think I like it. It is, as I mentioned, 2 colors per round, and you can really see that clearly here. There are only 2 colors being used, or sometimes 1. And indeed, most stranded color work is worked that way. You can get these amazing complex effects still working 2 per round, just based on how you change the colors. Fenton's Arrow, the cowl pattern in this issue, is gorgeous. I love it, and it's very clever because what you've got there is you've got variegated colors being used for stranded color work. So it looks incredibly sophisticated, like you've been working very hard with no additional effort at all. And if you look at patterns like Wintersolver and Aranya and the Great Horn-Rimmed Vest, you can see the effects are amazing and look very complicated, but not at all. It's just about the different colors changing at different times. So the vast majority of stranded color work is really only 2 per round, I promise. No matter how you hold your yarns, there is one thing you need to do, and that's stay consistent. Stay consistent about which is the upper, which is the right hand or left hand yarn, because we run into this problem called color dominance. These 2 swatches, you can see there's a pretty big difference in them. They're actually worked to exactly the same chart, and the pattern has exactly the same number of stitches in each color, but you see in the one here, the white is popping so much more than that. That's because the white stitches are larger. I was working those slightly looser. On this side, the orangey stitches are larger. They're slightly looser, and so this reads more orangey and this reads more white. Now, how that happens depends a little bit on how you're holding and tensioning your yarns. The general advice is that it's the lower yarn that pops a little bit more, but there are a lot of variables. Ultimately, what I would say here is simply be consistent about which is in your left hand, which is in your right, or which is the upper yarn and which is the lower yarn. I always make a note of it on my pattern just so I keep track. And it doesn't matter if the pattern indicates main color and contrast color. That's got nothing to do with it. It's simply the one that you're holding looser is going to be larger, and decide which one you want to pop more. The other method is intarsia, blobs of color, like my moose sweater. With intarsia, what you're doing is working only one color at a time. You can see this very clearly in these stripes. And here, what you have to do is twist the colors deliberately around each other. You can see they are joined. When you're knitting, if I just drop the red and pick up the white, I'm going to end up with unjoined pieces of knitting. So I have to deliberately cross them over each other, and there's no real science here about which way you go. Some people like to be consistent about the direction they go so it looks tidy on the inside. Your choice. Just twist them around each other when you change colors. And this is what I was saying about the techniques being very opposite. If you twist them around each other when you're working stranded colorwork, you're going to end up in a pickle. If you don't twist them around when you're working intarsia, you end up with unjoined, completely separate pieces of knitting. So intarsia is twisting, stranded colorwork, absolutely not twisting. These aren't the only ways of working with two colors. Stripes, of course, love stripes. Brioche, two-color brioche is gorgeous, and the Wicked Thicket hat in this current issue is an excellent use of that. Love it. And we've also got slip stitch colorwork, which I talked about before in a previous video column, and you see that used beautifully in the study hall shawl. I love working with different colors. It's a fantastic way of really personalizing your project, and no matter which method and which technique you're using, it definitely adds a lot of fun to your knitting.